I'm here with Matthew Van Meter to talk about his book, Deep Delta Justice. And we have a few questions for him about Deep Delta Justice, a Black teen, his lawyer, and their groundbreaking battle for civil rights in the South. This is a really fascinating read for anyone interested in the history of civil rights in law in the country, as well as race relations. But I was wanting to ask you, what drew you to this particular case and or moment in American history or civil rights history?
Yeah, thanks. I think a couple of things. The first was that this was not a story that had been widely told. This was not, I sort of stumbled on the story a bunch of years ago, and was shocked when I found that nobody had written a book about it yet. It was a case that was almost 50 years old at the time, and was super important. And as I got deeper into the process too, I realized that when we think about the civil rights movement, because we tend to focus on a few figures, particularly Martin Luther King, we don't actually talk a whole lot about Louisiana. And what I learned, and what readers of the book learn, is that the civil rights movement in Louisiana was not only different from the civil rights movement as we think of it in sort of mainstream like conceptions, but it's also in a lot of ways much more like the racial justice movement that we have now in the United States. We're decentralized and not with like one particular organization or leader at the fore. And I think so in that sense, I think the book and that moment in history, which is sort of underreported, has a lot to teach us today. In some ways, more than the kind of traditional story about the civil rights movement.
Yeah, I think having lived in Louisiana and noticing how different it is and decentralized was a really great word. My next question was, why do you think the story is important for today's readers? Or how is this case still relevant today? So can you just expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's sort of two things there. The book is, I'll say, a little bit of a bait and switch. So you come for this Supreme Court case, which is about the right to jury trial, and is very much about criminal justice. And that's sort of very much in my wheelhouse. I'm a criminal justice reporter. I work with incarcerated people. Criminal justice is like something around which my life revolves in a lot of ways. And the case was really important because it's the case that applied the clause in the Constitution that gives you a right to jury trial to the states. You did not, before Duncan versus Louisiana in 1968, have a right to a jury trial in state courts. Now, all states offered jury trials of one sort or another, but they didn't have to, and there was no standardization whatsoever of like how many people were on a jury or when you got a jury, or in Oregon and Louisiana in particular, and because of their history of white supremacy in those two states, had until 2020 had you could be found guilty by a jury that was not unanimous. Like what does jury even mean? This case set the groundwork for standardizing what a jury is. The the rest of it, the context of that, that's like the Supreme Court case. But it was all about the civil rights movement. And as I said, I think there's a lot to learn from the civil rights movement as it played out in Louisiana, where there was not a single charismatic leader, where the organizational structure was much more decentralized. It was generally right, instead of having like the big SCLC and SNCC and a couple of other big organizations, you had little tiny chapters of sometimes nameless, sometimes named local organizations duking it out on the local level. And that's much more the sort of fight that we have now and that we need to bring now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really striking what you were saying about the jury, because one of the things that most shocked me as I started reading this book, and it's not too much of a spoiler for our readers because it's at the beginning, is when the judge Perez is known to have told a jury, I think he says this guy's guilty as hell or he's a criminal, and just gone ahead and told the jury exactly how to vote. So that's a really striking example of what that standardization did and why we needed it. Wonderful. What was the most surprising or evocative thing you learned in researching this book?
It's a tough question to answer. I think the place is really important. Plaquemines Parish is a really unique place. It is sort of it's very close to New Orleans, but it is sort of at the ends of the earth as well. It's super remote. And that was, as much as I read about it before I went down there, and I had never been there before, there's kind of no way to describe just how kind of out there it is. I mean, it's a place that's like 98% water. And that geography plays a really important part of the story, the isolation and the fact that there's only one road on each bank of the Mississippi and all that stuff. You know, probably, but you know, I think that was sort of initially the most surprising or evocative thing. In a lot of ways, the most surprising thing for me, which was not surprising for the folks who had been down there and in the struggle, was just how important these little local groups were that we never hear about, and hopefully we'll hear more about, were in really dismantling the structure that we now call Jim Crow. That the big fights of the civil rights movement were important, but had very little to do with actually dismantling white supremacy in the South.
Yeah, that's a really compelling part of the book too, just these little moments that happen. I'm even just thinking of, what you said about how isolated that parish is and the decision of the lawyers to go down there and what that isolation means for their safety, but the bravery that they went ahead and did it. So
I mean, this was a place where in the churches, in Lower Plaquemines Parish, they would be putting before the Voting Rights Act was passed, they would be sneaking activists from New Orleans down in the trunks of their cars to their church, because church was the one place you could hang out as a Black person any hour of the day or night and not be harassed by the police, because they just figured you were doing church stuff, right? And they were learning how to beat the like racist constitutional interpretation test to be able to register to vote. But there were roadblocks and stuff. I mean, I had to be very careful. People died over that.
yeah, it's really inspiring though, that courage and that sort of thinking about that collective mindset that allowed them to win these small battles and then win larger battles. Thank you so much for speaking with us today, and we're really excited to have you at the Utah Humanities Book Festival.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
Yeah.